Once there was a man who loved deeply as any man has ever loved. But just as all men are mortal, so was this man's love also mortal as the heart in which it dwelled. This tale of love comes to us in the form of a short story written by H.G. Wells. The story is entitled The Pearl of Love. In his introduction to the story, Mr. Wells reminds us that the beauty of a pearl comes about through the suffering of a living creature. And indeed, great beauty often emerges from suffering. The author also tells us that this story is based on medieval Persian prose, which he suggests has been treated by scholars as allegorical, but which may, in fact, be true. To quote H.G. Wells, the story is laid in North India, which is the most fruitful soil for sublime love stories of all the lands in the world. It was in a country of sunshine and lakes and rich forests and hills and fertile valleys. And far away the great mountains hung in the sky, peaks, crests, and ridges of inaccessible and eternal snow. There was a young prince, lord of all the land, and he found a maiden of indescribable beauty and delightfulness, and he made her his queen and laid his heart at her feet. Love was theirs, full of joys and sweetness, full of hope, exquisite, brave, and marvelous love, beyond anything you have ever dreamt of love. It was theirs for a year and part of a year, and then suddenly, because of some venomous sting that came to her in a thicket, she died. She died, and for a while the prince was utterly prostrated. He was silent and motionless with grief. They feared he might kill himself, and he had neither sons nor brothers to succeed him. For 2 days and nights he lay upon his face, fasting, across the foot of the couch which bore her calm and lovely body. Then he arose and ate, and went about very quietly, like one who has taken a great resolution. He caused her body to be put in a coffin of lead, mixed with silver, and for that he had an outer coffin made of the most precious and scented woods, wrought with gold, and about that there was to be a sarcophagus of alabaster, inlaid with precious stones. And while these things were being done, he spent his time, for the most part, by the pools and in the garden houses and pavilions and groves, and in those chambers in the palace where they two had been most together, brooding upon her loveliness. He did not rend his garments, nor defile himself with ashes and sackcloth, as the custom was, for his love was too great for such extravagances. At last he came forth again among his counselors, and before the people, and told them what he had a mind to do. He said he could never more touch woman, he could never more think of them, and so he would find a seemly youth to adopt for his heir, and train him to his task, and that he would do his princely duties as became him, but that for the rest of it he would give himself with all his power and all his strength and all his wealth, all that he could command, to make a monument worthy of his incomparable dear lost mistress. A building it should be of perfect grace and beauty, more marvelous than any other building that had ever been or could ever be, so that to the end of time it should be a wonder, and men should treasure it and speak of it and desire to see it, and come from all the lands of the earth to visit and recall the name and the memory of his queen. And this building, he said, was to be called the Pearl of Love. And this his counselors and people permitted him to do, and so he did. Year followed year, and all the years he devoted himself to building and adorning the Pearl of Love. A great foundation was hewn out of the living rock, in a place whence one seemed to be looking at the snowy wilderness of the great mountain across the valley of the world. Villages and hills were there, a winding river, and very far away 3 cities. Here they put the sarcophagus of alabaster beneath a pavilion of cunning workmanship, and about it there were set pillars of strange and lovely stone, and wrought and fretted walls, and a great casket of masonry, bearing a dome and pinnacles and cupolas as exquisite as a jewel. At first the design of the Pearl of Love was less bold and subtle than it became later. At first it was smaller, and more wrought and encrusted. There were many pierced screens and delicate clusters of rosy-hued pillars, and the sarcophagus lay like a child that sleeps among flowers. The first dome was covered with green tiles, framed and held together by silver, but this was taken away again because it seemed close, because it did not soar grandly enough for the broadening imagination of the prince. For by this time he was no longer the graceful youth who had loved the girl queen. He was now a man, grave and intent, wholly set upon the building of the pearl of love. With every year of effort he had learnt new possibilities in arch and wall and buttress. He had acquired greater power over the material he had used, and he had learned of 100 stones and hues and effects that he could never have thought of in the beginning. His sense of color had grown finer and colder. He cared no more for the enameled, gold-lined brightness that had first pleased him, the brightness of an illuminated missile. He sought now for blue colorings like the sky, and for the subtle hues of great distances, for recondite shadows and sudden broad floods of purple opalescence, and for grandeur and space. He wearied altogether of carvings and pictures and inlaid ornamentation and all the little careful work of men. Those were pretty things, he said, of his earlier decorations, and had them put aside into subordinate buildings where they would not hamper his main design. Greater and greater grew his artistry. With awe and amazement people saw the pearl of love sweeping up from its first beginnings to a superhuman breadth and height and magnificence. They did not know clearly what they had expected, but never had they expected so sublime a thing as this. Wonderful are the miracles, they whispered, that love can do, and all the women in the world, whatever other loves they had, loved the prince for the splendor of his devotion. Through the middle of the building ran a great aisle, a vista, that the prince came to care for more and more. From the inner entrance of the building, he looked along the length of an immense pillared gallery and across the central area from which the rose-hued columns had long since vanished, over the top of the pavilion under which lay the sarcophagus, through a marvelously designed opening to the snowy wilderness of the great mountain, the lord of all mountains, 200 miles away. The pillars and arches and buttresses and galleries soared and floated on either side, perfect yet unobtrusive, like great archangels waiting in the shadows about the presence of God. When men saw that austere beauty for the first time, they were exalted, and then they shivered, and their hearts bowed down. Very often would the prince come to stand there and look at that vista, deeply moved, and yet not fully satisfied. The pearl of love had still something for him to do, he felt, before his task was done. Always he would order some little alteration to be made, or some recent alterations to be put back again. And one day he said that the sarcophagus would be clearer and simpler without the pavilion, and after regarding it very steadfastly for a long time, he had the pavilion dismantled and removed. The next day he came and said nothing, and the next day, and the next. Then for 2 days he stayed away altogether. Then he returned, bringing with him an architect and 2 master craftsmen and a small retinue. All looked standing together silently in a little group amidst the serene vastness of their achievement. No trace of toil remained in its perfection. It was as if the God of nature's beauty had taken over their offspring to himself. One thing there was to mar the absolute harmony. There was a certain disproportion about the sarcophagus. It had never been enlarged, and indeed how could it have been enlarged since the early days? It challenged the eye. It nicked the streaming lines. In that sarcophagus was the casket of lead and silver, and in the casket of lead and silver was the queen, the dear immortal cause of all this beauty. But now that sarcophagus seemed no more than a little dark oblong that lay incongruously in the great vista of the pearl of love. It was as if someone had dropped a small valise upon the crystal sea of heaven. Long the prince mused, but no one knew the thoughts that passed through his mind. At last he spoke. He pointed. "Take that thing away," he said. The end. There was another man who loved deeply, more deeply even than the young prince. His was a divine love, an immortal love that will outlive the stars and outlast the universe. He too told us a story about a pearl, a very different kind of pearl, a pearl of great price. In this story, a certain jeweler found an exquisite pearl, which he valued as being worth more than all he possessed. So he went and sold all that he had, and returned and bought the pearl. Our storyteller for this tale was the Lord Jesus Christ. The story was a parable, and the pearl he spoke of a metaphor for the kingdom of God, the worth of which, Jesus suggested, is beyond measure. A pearl forms when a grain of sand gets inside an oyster's shell, which injures the oyster, resulting in pain. The oyster coats the intruding grain in a smooth crystalline compound called nacre, or mother of pearl. If not for the injury, if not for the pain that oysters feel when this happens, there would be no such thing as pearls. The love that Christ bore for us, for all of us, for the world and everyone in it, brought him great suffering. And from that suffering emerged the pearl of salvation, a chance for all of us to be restored to fellowship with God, whereby we may enter his priceless kingdom. Imagine, if you will, a single perfect great pearl, matchless in its beauty and luster, and imagine upon it a single drop of blood. See in your mind the pearl of great price in his hand as he reaches out to a lost world, as he extends this invitation to you and to me. Please come and enter into my kingdom and live with me forever. See in your mind the Lord as he reaches out to a lost world. See the pearl of love in his hand, and upon it the red stain of blood that was the price he paid to afford us the opportunity to live forever with him in his incomparable palaces and pavilions in the city of God, the New Jerusalem, which will glisten like a jewel upon the new earth and stand for all eternity as a monument to his immortal love. Hear the Lord say, "Can a woman forget her nursing child? Can she feel no love for the child she has borne? But even if that were possible, I would not forget you. See, I have written your name upon the palms of my hands." Isaiah 49:15 and 16, New Living Translation. Sweet hearts may forget their loves. Warm hearts may grow cold when time, like a river, washes away memories of love. Mothers may abandon their daughters and fathers their sons, and the greatest of human loves may fail. But God's love will endure long after stars collapse and die and galaxies grow dim. And all anyone has to do to inherit this treasure is to say yes. Say it with me now. Say, yes. Yes, Lord, I accept you. Please accept me and draw me closer to you. And he will. This has been New Living Concepts. I'm Michael Bull.